My name is Clara Whitmore, and I'm 58 years old. She laughed while ruining my life. My so-called friend turned my grief into her favorite joke, mocking my dreams, calling me useless in front of everyone. I stayed silent then, but what she didn't know is that silence was the beginning of her downfall. Because the same story she ridiculed me for writing became the very one that exposed her to the entire world. I've spent most of my life trying to see the good in people, even when they made it almost impossible to find. It took one woman, one betrayal, to teach me that not everyone who claps for you wants to see you win. They say the cruelest words come not from enemies, but from those who smile at you while cutting you down behind your back. For years, I believed that kindness could protect me, that if I gave people my best, they would give me theirs in return. I live in a small, peaceful neighborhood in Vermont. The winters here are long and quiet, and the kind of silence that falls after the snow can either comfort you or crush you. For me, it was the latter. My husband, Robert, passed away 5 years ago from a sudden heart attack. We had no children, and when he died, the house that once felt full of laughter turned into a museum of memories I couldn't bear to touch. I used to wake up and hear his voice in my head, telling me to keep writing, to keep dreaming. He always believed in me more than I believed in myself. But after he was gone, I stopped writing. I stopped dreaming. I filled my days with small distractions, volunteering at the local library, attending community events, baking for neighbors. It was at one of those events that I met Denise Carrington. She was my age, elegant in her appearance, with a confidence that could fill a room. She talked fast, laughed loudly, and seemed to know everyone worth knowing. When she introduced herself, she told me she was in public relations, though I later realized she mostly worked part-time for the local Chamber of Commerce. Still, she carried herself like she owned the town. In the beginning, Denise felt like a blessing. She'd stop by with coffee, invite me to social gatherings, and tell me it was time to live again. She made me feel seen during a time when I felt invisible. I told her about Robert, about how much I missed him, and even about my love for writing. She called me a hopeless romantic, and at the time, I thought it was endearing. For years, I had toyed with the idea of writing a novel, something that combined all the little pieces of emotion that life had handed me. Grief, love, endurance, faith. I had notebooks full of half-formed ideas and paragraphs that never turned into anything. Denise was the first person I told about it after Robert's death. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, my hands trembling with both excitement and fear, as I described my story idea to her. It was about a woman rediscovering herself after loss. Denise listened with a polite smile, her eyes drifting to her phone now and then. When I finished, she gave a small laugh and said, "Clara, that's sweet, but maybe you should focus on something a little more realistic." That was the first crack. At first, I brushed it off, convincing myself that she meant well. But over the next few weeks, her comments grew sharper, cloaked in humor but dipped in poison. Whenever the topic of my writing came up, she'd roll her eyes or chuckle. "Our little author," she'd say, still chasing her fantasy life. People laughed along with her, and I laughed too, though it stung every single time. It wasn't until one spring evening that her cruelty became something I couldn't ignore. I had worked up the courage to show her a few pages of my manuscript. She skimmed through them, sighed, and handed the pages back. "Clara? You're wasting your time," she said flatly. "You're not a writer. You're just trying to fill the silence." I felt my heart drop, but before I could respond, she added, "You should be focusing on practical things, maybe volunteering more, or joining the senior center. Writing isn't for everyone, you know." Her words echoed in my head all night. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was fooling myself, trying to create something that would never be good enough. I closed my notebook that evening and tucked it away in the bottom drawer of my desk. I didn't open it again for months. But Denise wasn't finished. She found subtle ways to remind me of my failure. At gatherings, she'd mention me with a grin, saying things like, "Clara's still trying to write her big book," followed by exaggerated laughter. Once, at a neighborhood brunch, I overheard her telling others I was a useless widow trying to be famous. The words cut through me like glass. Useless. It was such a simple word, but it carried the weight of every insecurity I had ever buried. After that day, I avoided her as much as I could. I stopped attending events, stopped answering her calls, and distanced myself from the small circle of people we both knew. I told myself I was fine, that isolation was better than humiliation, but every time I passed by my writing desk, something inside me twisted. There were nights when I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying her voice in my head. I began to believe it that I truly was useless, that my dreams were foolish, that life had passed me by. My confidence didn't just crack, it crumbled. And yet, underneath all that pain, something faint and flickering remained. It was the same stubborn spark that Robert used to love about me, the part of me that refused to let someone else define my worth. I don't know exactly when that spark became a flame. Maybe it was the morning I looked at myself in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. Or maybe it was the moment I realized Denise's laughter didn't make her powerful, it made her small. Whatever it was, I made a silent promise to myself that day. I promised I would rise, not to prove her wrong, but to prove myself right. I would take the very word she used to break me useless and turn it into something she could never take credit for. I didn't know how or when, but I knew that one day, my story would matter. One day, I would tell it on my own terms. What I didn't realize then was that the revenge I was about to create wouldn't just destroy her lies, it would make my name known across the country. When betrayal becomes entertainment, the world suddenly feels smaller and colder than ever before. It's one thing to be mocked in private, but when your humiliation becomes part of someone else's amusement, the pain carves itself a little deeper into your soul. That's exactly what Denise did. What started as quiet criticism behind closed doors evolved into a public spectacle. She didn't just laugh at me anymore, she made sure everyone else laughed too. Denise had a talent for making cruelty sound like charm. She'd tilt her head, flash that rehearsed smile, and lace her venom with wit so others would mistake it for humor. At community events, she would introduce me as the lady who writes fairy tales about herself. People would laugh, not realizing the weight of those words or how deeply they cut. Each chuckle from the crowd felt like a knife twisting just a little more. I tried to play along, to pretend it didn't hurt, but every laugh echoed in my mind long after the gatherings ended. It didn't take long for word to spread. In a small Vermont town, gossip travels faster than wind through bare trees. Soon, people began treating me like a walking joke. Some would smile at me out of pity. Others avoided me altogether. As if my dream of writing was contagious foolishness. I started feeling invisible in the places I once loved. The library where I worked, the local cafe, where I used to sit and write. The humiliation followed me everywhere, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, Denise's shadow loomed over my every step. Eventually, I began to withdraw. I stopped attending the gatherings I once looked forward to. The laughter, the side glances, the forced politeness, it was too much to bear. I resigned from my part-time job at the library, telling myself it was time to rest, but deep down I knew I was hiding. Without that job, my days stretched endlessly, quiet and colorless. I spent hours staring out my window, watching other people live their lives while mine felt frozen in place. Money started running thin. I had some savings left from Robert's life insurance, but with no income, even grocery shopping began to feel like an indulgence. The loneliness crept in slowly, but once it settled, it felt permanent. I told myself I didn't need anyone, but the silence of an empty house tells you otherwise. I tried to distract myself with chores, reading, anything that could dull the ache of isolation, but nothing worked. Denise's words lived rent-free in my head, and the more I tried to forget them, the louder they grew. One afternoon, everything changed. I went to the local grocery store, something I rarely did anymore, and as I was walking down the baking aisle, I heard familiar laughter coming from the next row. Denise's voice was unmistakable. My instinct told me to leave, but curiosity held me in place. Through the shelves, I heard her talking to two women I vaguely recognized from the community club. She was saying that I had given up on life and that people like Clara never amount to anything. The women chuckled in agreement. That sentence never amounted to anything. It was as if all the air had been sucked out of me. I stood frozen for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, the grocery list trembling in my hand. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor, but something else started to burn inside me instead. It was anger, slow, simmering, righteous anger. For years, I had allowed other people to decide what I was worth. For years, I had let her voice drown out my own. But in that moment, something inside me refused to stay silent any longer. That night, I sat in front of my laptop for the first time in months. The screen's glow lit up the dark kitchen, casting soft reflections on the walls. My hands hovered over the keyboard, trembling not from fear, but from the intensity of emotion surging through me. I began to type. Not because I wanted to write, but because I needed to. Every word I wrote was laced with pain, fury, and defiance. For the first time, I didn't care about perfection. I didn't care about whether anyone would read it. I just wanted to pour out everything that had been festering inside me since the day Denise called me useless. Hours passed without me realizing it. My fingers moved faster than my thoughts. I wrote about the loneliness of widowhood, the cruelty of fake friends, and the strength it takes to survive when the world mocks your dreams. It wasn't fiction anymore, it was confession. Every paragraph felt like I was stitching together the broken pieces of myself. The writing became my therapy, my rebellion, my way of taking back control. Days turned into weeks. I wrote every night after sunset, the house quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the clicking of my keyboard. It was exhausting and liberating all at once. The more I wrote, the lighter I felt, as if I were draining the poison Denise had left in me. I didn't have a clear plan, no goal of publishing, no dream of fame. I was writing because it was the only way to stop the pain from swallowing me whole. Some nights, I'd pause and wonder if Denise would ever find out what she had inspired. I almost laughed at the thought she'd never imagine her cruelty could be the spark that reignited the very dream she tried to kill. I no longer wrote about romantic love or whimsical fantasies. My words were raw, honest, and unfiltered. They came from the deepest corners of my soul, and each page felt like reclaiming something she had stolen from me. One evening, I reached the final page of what would unknowingly become the beginning of my redemption. As I read through my work, I realized it wasn't just a story, it was a truth that millions of women could relate to. It was the pain of being dismissed, the quiet rage of being underestimated, and the beauty of finding yourself again. But I didn't think about sharing it then. I simply saved the file, titled it Untold, and closed my laptop. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a strange peace I hadn't felt in years. For once, the silence of my house didn't feel oppressive, it felt comforting, like a pause before something new. I had no idea that what I had written would one day reach far beyond my small Vermont town. That it would travel across screens, hearts, and conversations. I had no idea that my pain, transformed into words, would one day make people listen. My story of humiliation was about to become my weapon, and Denise had no idea it was aimed straight at her. Sometimes, rock bottom becomes the foundation for something extraordinary, if you dare to build from it. That thought stayed with me as the days began to blend together in quiet rhythm. The ache of humiliation had dulled into something sharper, something almost alive. For weeks after that night at the grocery store, I could think of nothing else but the words I had written. They lingered like a whisper in the back of my mind, urging me to return, to keep digging through the pain until I found its purpose. I didn't yet know that what I was creating would change my life. I only knew that I needed to finish it because it was the only thing keeping me from disappearing completely. I decided to turn the pages of my confession into a story, a real novel inspired by my experiences but shaped into something more universal. I changed the names, softened a few events, but the essence remained untouched. It was still my truth, wrapped in fiction so that I could bear to look at it. The friend who mocked me became a character with her own insecurities and ambitions. The woman she betrayed became someone who refused to be broken. It was raw, personal, and terrifying to write, Yet, every time I sat down at that old wooden desk, it felt like opening a door to freedom. I poured everything into it, every insult, every night of loneliness, every silent tear I'd swallowed rather than shed. The manuscript became my therapy, my redemption, and my rebellion all at once. Each paragraph pulled me closer to the woman I used to be, the woman who believed her voice mattered. There were nights when exhaustion blurred the words on the screen, but I kept going. I barely ate, barely slept, living on coffee and the quiet thrill of creation. I wrote until the sun rose, watching the morning light spill across my desk like a quiet promise that I was still here, still fighting. Slowly, the characters began to take shape. The cruel friend wasn't just cruel anymore, she was a person filled with bitterness, jealousy, and fear of being forgotten. The protagonist, though fragile at first, grew stronger with every chapter. She fell, she wept, she fought her way through every insult and every betrayal. By the time I reached the final page, she had become everything I had once dreamed of: being resilient, brave, unshakably herself. Writing her story became my act of forgiveness and defiance rolled into one. I realized that in giving her a voice, I was reclaiming my own. When I finally typed the last line, I stared at the document for a long time. It felt surreal, as if I'd reached the end of something much larger than a book. I titled it, "The Useless Woman." The irony wasn't lost on me. It was the word Denise had thrown at me like an insult. But here it became my triumph. I smiled faintly as I saved the file, the title glowing on the screen like a small act of revenge. I didn't have the money or connections to chase a traditional publisher, so I decided to self-publish it online. I read articles, watched tutorials, and spent nights learning how to format a manuscript properly. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. When I finally clicked the publish button, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I wasn't expecting sales or recognition. I just wanted it to exist somewhere outside of me. Somewhere it couldn't be erased. It was my closure, my silent way of saying that I had survived. For a few days, nothing happened. No emails, no comments, no sales. I tried not to feel disappointed, reminding myself that it wasn't about success. But deep down, I couldn't help but wonder if Denise had been right all along. If maybe I really was chasing something that didn't matter. Then, 2 weeks later, I woke up to a notification. Someone had bought my book. Just one copy, but it felt monumental. I remember smiling through tears, whispering a quiet thank you to no one in particular. That one reader meant the world to me. Days later, another copy sold, then another. And then something strange began to happen. People started sharing quotes from my book online. Someone had posted a passage about resilience on a small book club page, and it began to spread. I watched, stunned, as readers commented that the story felt real, heartbreaking, and too honest to be fiction. My inbox started filling with messages from women I had never met. They told me they saw themselves in my words, that my story made them feel seen and understood. Some said it gave them the courage to confront their own pain. It was overwhelming. I had spent years being invisible, mocked for daring to dream, and suddenly, strangers were telling me I mattered. The same words that Denise once used to crush me, useless, foolish, and naive, were now being turned into compliments. People thanked me for my vulnerability, my bravery, my truth. I sat at my desk reading those messages until tears blurred the screen. For the first time in years, I didn't feel useless. I felt alive. Every day brought new messages, new reviews, and new readers. The book climbed slowly but steadily in popularity. I began to see my name shared in places I never expected. Bloggers discussed the story, small reading groups recommended it to friends, and one local paper even featured it as a hidden gem. It was as if the universe had finally decided I'd earned my moment of light after years of shadows. And yet, even in that joy, a part of me remained cautious. I knew that with attention came curiosity, and curiosity often led to discovery. It was only a matter of time before someone connected the dots between my story and the real events that inspired it. I told myself it wouldn't matter that I had disguised everything well enough. But deep down, I knew the truth had a way of finding its way to the surface. As I sat one evening reading through another wave of kind messages, I caught my reflection in the dark window. For the first time, I saw not a widow or a failure, but a woman who had survived, who had turned her pain into something beautiful. My life was beginning to shift, and I felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the book Denise once mocked me for writing was now touching hearts everywhere. But success, I would soon learn, is a double-edged sword. The same story that healed me was about to awaken something dangerous. Because in a town as small as ours, secrets never stay buried for long. My book had started as a whisper of revenge, but now it was roaring through the lives of people who thought they had silenced me. And as the whispers reached Denise's ears, her world and mine was about to change forever. There's nothing more terrifying for a liar than seeing their reflection in someone else's truth. That's exactly what began to happen as the useless woman spread beyond anything I could have imagined. Within a few short weeks, the book had reached over 10,000 downloads. The numbers didn't even feel real to me. Every morning, I'd open my email to find new messages from readers around the world, women, men, even young adults sharing how deeply the story had moved them. They spoke about betrayal, resilience, and rediscovering strength. They quoted lines that I had written during my loneliest nights, and now those same words were giving others courage. It was surreal. At first, it seemed like pure joy. The kind of success I had only ever dared to imagine. But in a town as small as mine, joy rarely comes without a whisper of consequence. The gossip started quietly. A few curious readers from Vermont noticed that some details in the book felt oddly familiar: the setting, the tone, the personality of a certain character. They began to speculate that it wasn't entirely fiction, and then, inevitably, Denise's name started to surface in those quiet conversations. People began connecting dots. The sharp-tongued woman in my story who mocked her friend's dreams bore a striking resemblance to Denise Carrington, the very woman who had spent years ridiculing me. At first, Denise must have brushed it off as coincidence. But as the book's popularity grew, the whispers grew louder. Her friends, people who once laughed at her jokes, began avoiding eye contact at gatherings. Invitations that once filled her calendar began to disappear one by one. Her charm, which had once made her so magnetic, now seemed hollow in the face of public suspicion. It didn't take long for her to realize that the damage wasn't accidental, it was personal. One evening, as I was sitting on my porch with a cup of tea, my phone rang. I recognized her number immediately. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of me. When I answered, her voice was sharp and shaking with anger. She accused me of destroying her reputation, of turning the town against her. I could almost hear the panic in her breath as she told me that people were calling her names behind her back, that she couldn't walk into a room without feeling judged. For years, she had made me feel that way: small, ashamed, unworthy. Now, she was tasting the same bitterness she had once served me. But as she spoke, I didn't feel the satisfaction I expected. Instead, there was an eerie calm that settled over me. I realized I no longer needed to fight for validation. I had already won. My silence was my power now. I didn't raise my voice, didn't try to argue. I simply told her that the book was fiction and ended the call. For the first time, I hung up without trembling. In the weeks that followed, Denise's world continued to unravel. She stopped showing up at community events. Her closest friends distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with the scandal. People whispered about her when she wasn't around, debating whether the story was real. Some defended her, most didn't. It didn't matter that I had never used her name in the book. The resemblance was too precise, too painfully accurate. The truth had found its way out, and no amount of denial could cage it again. Meanwhile, my own life began shifting in strange ways. Strangers reached out to thank me, but those closest to me looked at me differently. Some admired my courage, others feared my honesty. I started questioning whether I had done the right thing. Yes, Denise had hurt me. But had I gone too far by exposing her through art? Was this justice? Or was it revenge disguised as healing? That question haunted me more than I wanted to admit. I told myself that I had never intended to ruin her life. I had only wanted to share my pain and perhaps inspire others who felt voiceless. But guilt doesn't always listen to logic. Late at night, I'd stare at the glowing screen of my laptop, rereading parts of the book and wondering if I'd crossed some invisible moral line. Had I become the very thing I despised, someone who used another person's weakness for validation? And yet, there was another truth I couldn't ignore. Denise's downfall wasn't my doing alone, it was the natural consequence of her actions. I had written a story, but she had lived the reality that inspired it. People recognized her cruelty because they had witnessed it. All I had done was shine a light on something she thought would forever stay hidden in the dark. The irony wasn't lost on me. The woman who had once mocked me for dreaming too big now feared being remembered for all the wrong reasons. The more she tried to deny it, the deeper she sank into the quicksand of her own reputation. Some people pitied her, but most agreed that karma had finally caught up. For years, I had believed that justice would never find her. But here it was not, with shouting or confrontation, but through the quiet power of truth. Still, even in victory, something inside me felt heavy. I had wanted to rise above her cruelty, not mirror it. Watching her crumble brought no real joy, just a dull ache of realization. Maybe that was the price of standing up for yourself, losing a bit of innocence along the way. It was around this time that I began receiving invitations to speak at local book clubs and small events. People wanted to hear the story behind the story. They wanted to know how I had transformed pain into prose. Every time I spoke, I focused on hope, on the strength that comes from choosing yourself even when no one else does. I avoided mentioning Denise entirely, but everyone seemed to know the truth anyway. As the days passed, I found myself torn between pride and remorse. My words had freed me, but they had also bound me to the consequences of honesty. For every reader who thanked me, there was a small voice in my head whispering, "Did you go too far?" Then, one afternoon, as I sat by the window watching the last autumn leaves drift to the ground, an email notification appeared on my screen. It was from someone I didn't recognize, a woman named Lillian Brooks from a publishing agency in New York. Her message was short but powerful. She said she had read The Useless Woman, found it remarkable, and wanted to discuss a potential publishing deal. My hands trembled as I reread the email. A part of me wanted to laugh, another wanted to cry. The timing felt almost cruel. Just when I had begun to question my intentions, the universe offered me a door to something bigger. I closed my laptop and sat in silence for a long time. Denise's voice no longer haunted me. The echoes of her laughter had finally faded, replaced by something else: opportunity. I didn't know it then, but that message would change everything again. What began as an act of pain turned into a phenomenon I couldn't control. For years I had lived, in the shadow of humiliation and loss, convinced that my voice didn't matter. But now, the very story born from that silence was echoing farther than I could have dreamed. The email from Lillian Brooks, the literary agent from New York, felt almost unreal when I first read it. She said she'd stumbled across The Useless Woman through an online review and had been struck by its honesty. She described it as the kind of story that lives in the bones long after it's read. Her words made my hands tremble. I had written from a place of despair, never expecting anyone beyond a few readers to care. Now, someone wanted to bring my pain to bookshelves across the country. Lillian's voice was warm and confident when we spoke for the first time. She said she believed the book had the potential to touch lives on a national scale and offered to represent me officially. She handled everything: the contracts, the editing, the logistics. I didn't understand. All she asked of me was to keep being authentic. Within months, The Useless Woman went from being a quiet online story to a printed book sitting on physical shelves. Seeing it displayed in bookstores was an emotion I can't quite describe. It felt like validation, redemption, and disbelief all at once. Soon after, the sales began to rise faster than anyone expected. Online orders flooded in, book clubs featured it as their monthly read, and social media buzzed with discussions about the story that felt too true to be fiction. The publisher started organizing interviews and podcasts for me. I traveled to radio stations, small studios, and literary events to talk about resilience, self-worth, and the courage to reclaim one's voice. Every conversation reminded me of the nights I had spent alone, doubting that my voice mattered. Now, it wasn't just being heard, it was inspiring others to find their own. The success was intoxicating and terrifying at the same time. My name, once mocked and whispered with pity, had become a symbol of strength for women who felt invisible. Readers sent letters, sharing their own experiences of betrayal and survival. Some called me brave, others called me an inspiration. I didn't feel like either. I just felt grateful. The woman who had once been humiliated at community events was now standing in front of cameras, her story celebrated instead of ridiculed. Yet, with the spotlight came a new kind of shadow. The public's curiosity began to stretch beyond the pages of my book. Interviewers started asking the question I had been dreading: who was the real friend behind the story? I always deflected gently, saying that the book was a blend of fiction and emotion. But people wanted more. They wanted a face to pair with the villain. Every time I avoided the question, speculation grew. And then, Denise reappeared. At first, it was subtle. A few posts on social media, cryptic enough to avoid naming me, but obvious enough for people who knew us both to understand who she was referring to. She claimed that the book was a fabrication of jealousy, a story twisted by a bitter woman looking for attention. Her words spread quickly, as venom often does. It was like watching an old wound reopen just when it had begun to heal. For years, she had controlled the narrative in our small town. Now that control was slipping, and she was desperate to reclaim it. She told people that I had exaggerated everything, that the book wasn't art but a revenge fantasy. At first, her words hurt. But soon, I found myself reacting differently. I didn't panic or retreat this time. Instead, I felt an unexpected calm. Denise's attempts to rewrite the truth only made her look smaller in the grander story that had already taken root. I realized something profound during that time. The truth doesn't need to shout, it simply needs to exist. My readers could sense authenticity in every line I had written, and no rumor could erase that. While Denise scrambled to defend herself from a story she had inspired, I continued to receive messages from people who told me that my words had changed their lives. It became clear to me that I didn't need to fight her in the same way she fought me. I didn't need to use bitterness or accusations. Still, I won't pretend it was easy. There were nights when I questioned whether I had done the right thing. I wondered if I should publicly address her claims, perhaps set the record straight once and for all. But every time I considered it, I remembered the promise I had made to myself years earlier that I would rise, not through spite, but through truth. The noise around the controversy eventually grew louder. News outlets picked up the story, not about me and Denise directly, but about how the useless woman had blurred the line between fiction and reality. Some praised the mystery, others criticized it. But in all that chaos, I noticed something extraordinary. My silence spoke louder than any denial or confession could. The more I refused to engage, the more dignified I appeared. People began to see me as the woman who had turned pain into art without losing her grace. Despite Denise's efforts, her lies couldn't keep up with the momentum of truth. My book tour expanded. Invitations poured in from all over the country. I found myself standing in auditoriums filled with strangers who clapped when I walked on stage. I spoke about how pain can become purpose, how cruelty can be the spark for growth if you channel it right. I no longer needed to mention Denise or defend my story. My success had already done that for me. But success is a strange thing. It brings peace and chaos in equal measure. There were moments of loneliness amid all the applause, quiet nights in hotel rooms where I missed the simplicity of my old life. I would look at my reflection and remind myself that the woman I had become was built from everything I had endured. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that my story wasn't finished yet. I began to feel an urge to go deeper, not into fiction this time, but into truth. Fiction had freed me, but it had also blurred lines I now wanted to define clearly. The world had heard my story once through a character's voice. Now I wanted to tell it in my own. Not to accuse or to settle scores, but to reclaim every part of myself that had been twisted or misunderstood along the way. One night, in a quiet hotel room in Chicago after a book signing, I opened my laptop again. The blank page didn't scare me anymore. It felt like an invitation. I titled the new document, "The Woman Behind the Words." It would be my second book, but this time, it wouldn't be fiction at all. Silence can be noble, but sometimes, speaking your truth is the only way to heal. For years, I had allowed my story to exist behind the safety of fiction. It was easier to let readers see fragments of me through characters rather than revealing my full truth. But, as the useless woman continued to ripple through lives and conversations, I began to feel an ache inside me, a quiet voice whispering that I wasn't finished yet. I had told my story, yes, but not my truth. There was still something incomplete about hiding behind a name that wasn't mine, about softening the sharp edges of what really happened. And so, I decided to write again. This time, without disguise. I titled my second book, "The Woman Behind the Words." It wasn't a novel. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a memoir, my story, laid bare, unfiltered, and unapologetically real. I promised myself I wouldn't write to hurt anyone. I would write to heal. Not just for myself, but for anyone who had ever been silenced, shamed, or made to feel invisible. I wouldn't name Denise directly, but I would tell the truth exactly as I lived it. Every page would be an act of reclamation, a way to take back my voice from the years I had given it away. When I told my publisher about my idea, they hesitated at first. Memoirs carried a risk, especially one that brushed so close to controversy. But they saw the determination in me, the unshakable calm that comes when you know your story deserves to be told. They agreed to move forward, and I began writing with a clarity I'd never felt before. The words flowed easily this time, not from pain, but from peace. I no longer wrote to prove anything. I wrote to understand. I wrote to close the circle that had haunted me for nearly a decade. Denise found out about the project before it was even finished. I shouldn't have been surprised. Small towns have their own network of invisible threads, and somehow, the news reached her. One afternoon, I received an email from her lawyer threatening legal action if the book contained anything that could damage her reputation. For a moment, my stomach sank. The old fear crept back, the fear of being powerless again. But then I remembered who I was now. I wasn't the same woman who had once hidden behind drawn curtains and silenced dreams. I forwarded the email to my publisher and continued writing. When The Woman Behind the Words was finally released, it caused an immediate stir. The first reviews called it a powerful reckoning with silence. Readers applauded its honesty and vulnerability. They said it felt like reading the diary of someone who had survived fire and learned to dance in the ashes. I had worried people might judge me, but instead, they embraced the rawness. They didn't see a woman trying to expose anyone. They saw someone reclaiming her truth. It was both humbling and freeing. Denise, however, didn't take it quietly. As expected, she tried to threaten legal action again, claiming defamation and emotional distress. But there was nothing in my book she could use against me. I had told the truth, and truth has a way of protecting itself. My lawyers assured me that she had no grounds. Everything I wrote was backed by experience, reflection, and emotion, not accusation. She had no proof, only guilt. Eventually, her bluster faded into silence. Meanwhile, the memoir spread like wildfire. It went viral even faster than my first book. People shared passages on social media with captions like, "This is what healing looks like," and "She turned pain into power." Television networks invited me for interviews, and magazines called it a testament to the power of transformation. It was surreal to see my face on covers and hear my name spoken with respect instead of ridicule. Each success felt like a quiet victory for every woman who had ever been dismissed as useless. The changes in my life went beyond fame. Financially, I was finally secure. Emotionally, I felt lighter. Socially, I was surrounded by people who admired not just my writing but my resilience. I had become what I once needed, a voice reminding others that it's never too late to begin again. Yet, in the midst of all the admiration, there was an emptiness I couldn't quite name. The revenge that had once fueled me no longer mattered. The validation that had once seemed vital now felt small. I realized that true healing wasn't about seeing Denise fall, it was about no longer needing her downfall to feel whole. As the months passed, I heard less and less about her. People said she had stopped showing up anywhere, that she'd sold her house and moved away. It should have felt like closure, but instead, it left me with an odd sense of melancholy. I had once thought I would celebrate this day, but victory felt strangely hollow. Maybe because I knew that behind all her cruelty, she was still human, flawed, fragile, and broken in her own way. One evening, after a long book tour, I returned home to Vermont. The air was cold, the kind that bites gently at your skin, reminding you that winter is near. My house was quiet, filled with the comforting hum of solitude. I made tea, sat by the fireplace, and reflected on how far I'd come. I had faced the kind of pain that could have ruined me. Yet here I was alive, thriving, and at peace. Still, part of me couldn't help but wonder if Denise ever found her own peace. I doubted it. People who live by tearing others down rarely know how to build something within themselves. Then, one morning, something unexpected happened. I went out to collect the mail, the kind of ordinary task that usually held no surprises. But that day, tucked among the bills and letters, was an envelope that made my heart skip a beat. My name was written in familiar cursive handwriting, the same loops and curves I had seen on countless notes years ago. It was Denise's handwriting. I stood at the mailbox for a long moment, staring at it, unsure whether to open it or throw it away. My fingers trembled slightly as I turned it over. The past I thought I had buried was suddenly at my doorstep again, wrapped in white paper and ink. I brought the letter inside and placed it on the table beside my cup of tea. For a long while, I just looked at it, debating whether I even wanted to know what it contained. After all these years, what could she possibly have to say? And yet, despite the quiet I had built for myself, despite all the healing and forgiveness I had tried to cultivate, I knew I couldn't ignore it. Some truths, no matter how much you want to leave them behind, always find a way back to you. Sometimes the very person you want to destroy hands you the key to forgiveness. I hadn't expected anything from Denise ever again. I thought her chapter in my life was over, closed and shelved with all the bitterness that came with it. But that morning, standing in my kitchen with her letter trembling in my hand, I realized life has a strange way of circling back. The envelope felt heavier than paper should. The handwriting on the front, familiar, shaky, and painfully human, made my heart ache in a way I didn't anticipate. I sat down at the table, staring at it for a long moment, before finally tearing it open. The letter inside was handwritten on lined notebook paper. The ink was slightly smudged in places, as if tears had fallen on it while she wrote. Her words started cautiously, almost as if she didn't believe she had the right to speak to me. She began by saying she didn't expect forgiveness, but that she needed to unburden herself before she could move on. As I read further, I realized this wasn't an attempt to defend her past, it was a confession. She admitted that envy had poisoned her long before my success ever arrived. She wrote that she had watched me handle tragedy with grace after Robert's death, and that something inside her twisted with resentment because she couldn't do the same. She confessed that she had resented my kindness, the patience I had shown even when others were cruel. She said she had projected her own failures onto me because it was easier than facing them herself. "You were everything I wanted to be," she wrote, "but instead of learning from you, I tried to tear you down so I wouldn't have to see myself reflected in what I lacked." Reading those words, I felt a mix of emotions so tangled I could barely breathe. Anger flickered, first anger for the years she had stolen from me, for the way she had made me doubt myself, but that anger quickly gave way to pity. For the first time, I saw Denise not as the woman who had mocked me, but as a deeply wounded person. Her cruelty hadn't come from confidence, it had come from fear. And beneath that realization was something softer, something I hadn't expected: sorrow. Not for what she had done, but for what she had become because of it. She apologized for every insult, every rumor, every time she had made me feel small. "You didn't deserve the things I said," she wrote. "You were never useless. I was the one who didn't know my worth." I read the letter 3 times that morning. Each time, different parts hit me harder. The first time, I felt defensive. The second time, reflective. By the third, I simply felt tired. All the emotions I had carried for years, rage, vindication, bitterness, seemed to drain out of me with every sentence. I realized that revenge hadn't healed me. It had only shifted my pain elsewhere. I had written, published, and risen above, but I had never truly let go. In trying to prove her wrong, I had unknowingly kept her alive in my story far longer than she deserved. That night, I didn't write anything. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to put my thoughts into words. I just sat by the fireplace with the letter beside me, listening to the soft crackle of the flames and letting the silence wash over me. I didn't feel triumphant or angry. I just felt human again, flawed, fragile, and deeply alive. The next morning, I placed the letter in my journal, not to dwell on it, but to remember it. It became a quiet symbol of closure. I decided not to respond publicly. I didn't owe anyone a spectacle of reconciliation. This was between two women who had once hurt each other deeply and were finally learning how to let go. I didn't forgive her immediately, but I forgave myself for holding on to the pain for so long. In the weeks that followed, something inside me began to shift. Success no longer felt like a weapon, it felt like a bridge. The interviews, the book tours, the applause, they were no longer about proving my worth to anyone. They were about sharing a message I now fully believed in, that healing doesn't come from revenge, it comes from release. I began volunteering at community centers and small writing workshops, mentoring women who wanted to tell their stories but didn't know how. I told them that their voices mattered, that no pain was too small to be turned into purpose. Watching them find confidence in their words gave me a sense of fulfillment deeper than any bestseller list ever could. My life became quieter, but richer. The anger that had once driven me was replaced with compassion. I found myself wishing peace for Denise. Truly wishing it, wherever she was. It surprised me how natural it felt. I no longer saw her as my antagonist. She was simply a woman who had walked her own lonely road, stumbling in ways I could finally understand. We were both products of our own wounds, but I had chosen to heal, and she had chosen to hide. The letter became my constant reminder that closure doesn't always arrive with fanfare. It sometimes arrives in shaky handwriting and tear-stained paper. I realized that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting what happened. It meant freeing myself from the endless replay of pain. I started sleeping better. I started smiling more. When readers spoke to me about how my books had helped them find courage, I felt genuinely humbled. My story had outgrown the bitterness that once birthed it. And yet, just as I began to settle into that peace, life decided to test me once again. Fate, it seems, isn't done with us until it's certain we've learned what we're meant to. Months later, I was invited to a literary panel at a nearby city, a celebration of local authors whose work had made an impact nationally. It felt like a beautiful milestone, one that symbolized everything I had worked for. I prepared my speech, focusing on empowerment and the importance of truth in storytelling. As I packed my notes into my purse the morning of the event, I caught a glimpse of Denise's letter peeking out from my journal on the desk. For reasons I couldn't explain, I tucked it into my bag. Perhaps a part of me sensed that the past wasn't done with me yet. The event hall was warm and crowded, filled with laughter and anticipation. I greeted fellow authors, signed a few books, and prepared myself to speak before the audience. My nerves buzzed with excitement rather than fear. But as I turned toward the stage, scanning the faces in the front row, my heart nearly stopped. There she was, Denise. Thinner, older, and visibly nervous, she sat in the second row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Our eyes met for the briefest moment, and in that instant, every emotion I had thought I'd buried came rushing back. Fate, it seemed, wasn't finished after all. It's strange how time softens anger, yet one look can bring all the old emotions rushing back. When I first saw Denise sitting in the audience that evening, I froze. The room around me seemed to fade into a blur of faces and soft murmurs. She looked different, thinner, quieter, older. The confidence that used to radiate from her like a spotlight was gone. She sat near the front, hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the stage. For a moment, I wondered if I was imagining her. But when our eyes met, she gave me a small nod, one filled not with arrogance, but something else entirely: humility. The panel began as planned. I listened as other authors spoke about their journeys, their inspirations, their struggles. My turn was last, and as I waited, I could feel my heartbeat thudding in my chest. I wasn't afraid of her anymore, but her presence stirred something deep and uneasy within me. Years of memories, humiliation, and redemption condensed into that single moment. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was now standing on a stage. The woman once mocked for dreaming, while the person who'd called me useless sat quietly among my listeners. When it was finally my turn to speak, I walked to the podium, the audience's applause echoing softly in my ears. I began my talk as I always did, with honesty. I spoke about how storytelling had saved me, how pain could be transformed into purpose if you were brave enough to confront it. I told them about the years of silence and the power of finding your voice, but the whole time, I could feel her gaze on me, steady and unflinching. It wasn't confrontational, it was reflective, almost tender. After my talk, the moderator opened the floor for questions. A few audience members asked about my writing process, others about my inspiration. Then, from the second row, a hand went up. My stomach tightened. It was Denise. For a brief second, the air in the room felt heavier, as though everyone sensed what was about to happen. The moderator hesitated, then gestured toward her. She stood slowly, smoothing the front of her blouse, and cleared her throat. Her voice, though quiet, carried through the hall. "I'm not here to ask a question," she began. "I'm here to tell the truth." A murmur rippled through the crowd. She paused, her eyes meeting mine before continuing. "Many of you have read The Useless Woman. Some of you might already know who I am, though my name was never used." The audience fell completely silent. Even the sound of the air conditioner seemed to disappear. Denise took a deep breath and continued, her tone trembling but steady. "I was the friend from that story," she said. "I was the one who made another woman feel small because I couldn't face my own failures. I hurt her because I was hurting. And though she never named me, I knew every word was true." There was a long, stunned pause before the room erupted into applause, not for me this time, but for her. It wasn't a cheer of celebration. It was the sound of collective relief. People respected the courage it took for her to stand there, vulnerable and accountable, in front of hundreds. I stood frozen, my throat tightening. For years, I had imagined what it would be like to see her humbled, to hear her admit what she had done. But now that it was happening, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like grace. For the first time, I saw courage in her, the same kind of courage I once wished I had. She had come to face her truth in the most public way possible, not to erase her past, but to acknowledge it. When the applause began to die down, I felt compelled to stand. Slowly, I rose from my chair and faced her. "Thank you," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Thank you for your honesty." I turned to the audience and added, "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of what's already been done." I've forgiven her, and I've forgiven myself. The crowd applauded again, louder this time, as if something sacred had unfolded before them. I saw tears in the eyes of people I'd never met, men and women who had come to hear about books but instead witnessed something real and raw. It wasn't about winners or losers anymore. It was about truth, about growth, about two women finally standing on equal ground after years of silence. After the panel ended, people surrounded me, offering hugs and words of admiration. Denise stayed seated for a moment, waiting for the crowd to thin. When I finally approached her, she stood and smiled softly. Her eyes were red, but there was a calmness in them I had never seen before. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other. No words, no explanations, just quiet understanding. I reached out and touched her hand gently. She squeezed it once and nodded before turning to leave. We didn't become friends again. Some wounds close, but they leave scars that remind you where you've been. Still, we walked away in peace, and that was enough. It felt as though a heavy chapter of my life had finally found its ending. I watched her exit the hall through the side door. Her shoulders relaxed, her pace slow but steady. It was the first time I had seen her look free. Later that evening, after the event, the organizers told me that the moment had been recorded. They planned to post it online as part of the official highlights. I didn't think much of it at the time, but within days, it spread across social media. People everywhere were sharing clips of our exchange. Headlines read things like, "Rival turned redeemed, the real-life story of forgiveness." Thousands of comments poured in, from people saying they cried watching it, that it restored their faith in empathy and redemption. For years, my story had been about pain, betrayal, and reclaiming my worth. But that night, it became something greater. It became about grace. The image of Denise standing in that audience, admitting the truth, would stay with me forever. It wasn't just her moment, it was ours. The world saw two women who had hurt and healed, each finding redemption in their own way. When the event finally ended, and I stepped outside into the cool night air, I felt lighter than I had in decades. The city lights shimmered in the distance, and the air smelled faintly of rain. As I walked toward my car, a soft breeze brushed my face, and I realized something profound: my real story wasn't over. It had only changed shape. What had begun as a tale of vengeance and vindication had transformed into one of compassion and release. I looked back at the building one last time before driving away, knowing that something beautiful had just ended and something even greater was about to begin. Sometimes, the best revenge is living a life that proves every cruel word wrong. As the years passed, the storm that once defined me began to calm into something steady and beautiful. I continued to write, but no longer from a place of pain. My stories became celebrations of survival, love, and rediscovery. I had learned that writing didn't just heal wounds, it built bridges, connecting people who had once believed they were alone in their suffering. Each new story became a thread woven into a tapestry of resilience, not just for me but for everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough. My third book was unlike anything I'd written before. It wasn't born from grief or anger, but from a quiet confidence that had taken root deep within me. It focused on women, over 50 women who had lived through heartbreak, loss, betrayal, and change, finding their strength again. I wanted to capture the beauty of aging, the power of experience, and the magic of second chances. I called it Unbroken Seasons, and when it was published, it exceeded every expectation I'd dared to have. Within months, it became a national bestseller. Bookstores couldn't keep it in stock, and online readers flooded the reviews with stories of how it had reignited their belief in themselves. It was strange to think that the woman who had once been mocked for chasing impossible dreams was now inspiring others to chase their own. The irony wasn't lost on me, but it no longer felt like revenge. It felt like purpose. The media called me a voice for women rediscovering their worth, but I didn't write for recognition. I wrote because I understood now that every word, every page, was a form of gratitude, a way of saying thank you to the woman I used to be, the one who refused to give up even when she had every reason to. When the first royalty check arrived from Unbroken Seasons, I decided to do something just for myself. I bought a small house overlooking the lake near my hometown. The same lake where I used to sit with a notebook, scribbling half-finished stories no one ever read. The house was simple white with blue shutters, surrounded by wildflowers in the summer and golden leaves in the fall. Every morning, I would brew a cup of coffee, sit by the window, and watch the sunlight ripple across the water. It was peaceful in a way that success alone could never give me. That little house became my sanctuary. Sometimes I would imagine telling my younger self, the lonely widow sitting in that same town years ago, that she would one day live here, that she would not only survive but thrive. I imagined her disbelief, the way she might laugh and shake her head. Yet here I was, living proof that no one stays broken forever. Letters from readers continued to pour in, thousands of them from across the country. Women told me that my journey had given them courage to leave toxic relationships, to start new careers, to write their own truths. Some said they had started book clubs around my work. Others sent photos of their mothers or grandmothers holding my novels, smiling through tears. Each message reminded me that pain, when shared honestly, can become light for someone else's darkness. That realization filled me with a sense of fulfillment far greater than revenge ever could. It was during one of those quiet lake mornings that I truly understood what success meant. It wasn't about punishing those who hurt you or proving them wrong. It was about proving your worth to yourself, about creating a life that no longer needed validation. For so long, I had been chasing vindication, thinking it would bring peace. But real peace came when I stopped needing to win and started simply living. In time, I heard that Denise had moved away. She sold her house quietly, without much announcement or fanfare. The last I heard, she had relocated to a smaller town a few states over, where no one knew her story. I didn't feel triumph or satisfaction when I learned that. I just hoped she had found some semblance of peace. We hadn't spoken since that night at the panel, but sometimes, when I thought of her, I felt gratitude. She had been the storm that forced me to rebuild my life stronger. Without her cruelty, I might never have found my voice. As my books reached wider audiences, I was invited to speak at conferences and literary festivals around the country. Standing before those crowds, I would look at the faces of people young and old, women and men listening to my words, and I felt something sacred in those moments. My story had begun in humiliation, but it had evolved into something redemptive. I no longer saw my past as a wound, but as the foundation on which I had built my future. Years later, during one of my talks, a young woman asked me what my biggest lesson had been through it all. I smiled and told her, "That cruelty can't define you unless you let it. The world will always have someone ready to tear you down, but your power lies in what you choose to build from the ruins." The audience clapped, but I wasn't thinking about applause. I was thinking about the long path it had taken to learn that truth, about the nights of doubt and grief that had forged it. Now, as my story continues to spread, I often reflect on the strange, winding road that brought me here. I think about the word that once haunted me, useless. It's almost funny how that one word used to carry so much power. How it once defined the limits of who I thought I could be. Now, it's just a memory. A chapter from a different life. The woman who was once mocked for her dreams has become a symbol of what it means to refuse defeat. Looking back, I wouldn't erase any of it, not the humiliation, not the heartbreak, not even the years of silence. Every painful moment carved out space for strength to grow. Every cruel word I endured became part of the foundation that carried me forward. I used to think my revenge would be in her downfall, but I was wrong. My revenge was in my rise. It was in the peace I found, the purpose I built, and the lives I touched along the way. And now, as my books continue to travel the world, landing on nightstands and in libraries, and in the hands of women who see themselves in my story, I feel something deeper than satisfaction. I feel closure. I feel gratitude. As I sit by the lake, watching the ripples spread across the water, I think about all the versions of myself that led me here. The grieving widow, the humiliated friend, the relentless writer. They all built the woman I am today. And now, as my viral book continues to echo across the world, I can finally say with certainty she was wrong. I was never useless. I was unstoppable. In the end, I learned that revenge doesn't always look like destruction sometimes. It looks like peace. The woman who once called me useless gave me the reason to find my worth. Her cruelty built the fire that shaped my strength, and my silence became louder than her laughter ever was. I didn't just prove her wrong, I proved myself right. Because the best revenge isn't ruin. It's becoming everything they said you couldn't be. If my story touched something inside you, don't let it end here. Share it with someone who needs to remember their own strength, and if you believe every voice deserves to be heard, hit like and subscribe so more women can find theirs too. Tell me in the comments, have you ever been called useless and turned that pain into your power?